Please make your way back to the concert hall for the continuation of our program. We will resume in just a few minutes.
She wants to interrogate me. She's going to see if she can catch me.
Please welcome to the stage Green Builder Media CEO Sarah Gutterman, Susan Kuchera, and General Wesley Clark.
Where would you, I think you should be close over here. So this session was originally supposed to just be a casual conversation between myself and the internationally esteemed and award-winning director, producer, and cinematographer Susan Kuchera, who recently released a film with Jeff Bridges. We had some of the film clips in our opening video. However, since General Wesley Clark is actually in that movie and is friends with Susan, he's back by popular demand. And I gathered a bunch of questions from you all during the break, where there were some excellent questions. So Susan and I are going to tag team on the general. I'm going to ask her a couple of questions first, and then we're going to ask several of your questions from his session, as well as a few things from the movie that I think Susan wants to point out. So first, though, Susan, I think you have had a lifetime of directing and producing and filming movies. As I mentioned, you just released Living in the Future's Past with Jeff Bridges, co-produced with Jeff Bridges, which is a fascinating film. And for those of you who have not seen it, I highly recommend it. It's a wonderful film that explores how human beings evolved in terms of our behavior and why we are wired to believe that more is more. It explored from the time when we evolved, when we had to hoard resources, living in caves, and any time that we actually were able to access food, it was kind of like an aha moment, like, wow, I need this, lots of it. So we hoarded, but unfortunately, we haven't necessarily evolved in a way that is in accordance with our environmental and economic realities. So, Susan, my first question to you is, in producing this film, and you can punt it over to...
What's that?
After you answer a little bit, you can punt it over to him too. But so there's this mentality in society that I call the seduction of more, right? Bigger houses, bigger cars, more resources. There's something that in our Western culture is very sexy about the seduction of more. But in your movie, you explore how we can actually break through that with emergent behavior and with cognitive learning and some of these concepts. So can you first talk about how the movie really brings to light how we can affect, in a positive way, cultural behavior en masse to propel us towards a more sustainable future?
I will try. I'm an artist, and so my job is to synthesize what people like Wesley Clark had to say, who's also in the film, and we had other energy experts, and we had cognitive scientists, and we did look at the history of humanity, and we kind of see it as a whole huge superorganism, regardless of what's going on politically, where it's us and our stuff, and more of us and more of our stuff. And we look at surplus, we look at optimal foraging theory, we look at emergence, we look at entropy. A lot of the things that Wesley discussed, or should I refer to you as the general, discussed in his talk is also in the film. And Jeff and I, we're just regular people. We're both just artists. We're not, well, he's good at speaking in front of people. I'm not. But we thought if we tried to make a film that was different enough that people would actually grasp the situation without feeling hopeless, but also not give people some pie-in-the-sky idea of what our future looks like, and we understood that, then we thought the general public would as well. And it seems to be working because the film is being taught at Harvard. People like the Solar Rollers, they teach energy education to high school students. We won an award from the UN. We've gotten a humanitarian award. It was quite a feat. It took 2.5 years to put together, and I'm just so grateful that you decided to be in the film. So we hope that you will watch it, because if you share it with friends who might not be kind of in the same wavelength that you are, it's a very non-confrontational way to understand these various subjects and how we all fit in to this fabric that we're making together.
Thank you. And Susan, let me ask you one more question before I have a whole host of questions for you, General. Susan, you're a visual storyteller, and as you said, you're an artist, and you took some really complex concepts and some big thinkers like the General and others, and you broke down their messages into a beautiful movie with incredible imagery. Can you talk to us about how you did that within the context of the film so that we may draw some ideas and inspiration for how we as business people, as building professionals, as sustainability professionals, even as students, may be more effective in our messaging about some of these complex topics?
Well, I think we see the news every day, we read things, we know things, and yet we still are kind of unclear about what to do or how we fit in. And I think that the film and the blend of imagery allows us to see this connectionism that happens between all of us. And I don't know how to describe it. I mean, I am a filmmaker. I filmed in Iceland. I filmed a lot in Maui, where we live. We have several different climate zones, so that was easy to do. Whales. And as I was editing it together, it was each part, well, how I understand the information, but how does it make me feel? Because I think if you're not feeling anything, you're not going to be so as inclined to really want to do something different.
I think that's a great point, because truly when you are passionate and when you're animated about a topic, it lends itself to more effective messaging. So let me translate that question, General, into your world. I was collecting some questions from some folks in the audience during the break, and there were several that had the same theme, which is, how can we effectively smash the partisan divide so that a wide spectrum of people and people who might not be in agreement with us today can actually climb on board and help us pursue a more sustainable future and economy?
Well, first of all, politics is about money, and there's just no other way to say it. If you go back to the origins of the United States of America, it was not the poor people who threw the tea boxes overboard at Boston Harbor in 1774, or met in Philadelphia. These were the elites who met. They didn't like being cheated by the British. That's what it came down to. People's economic interests were affected. That's why the original voting required a property ownership requirement. So it wasn't just women couldn't vote, it was if you were a poor person, you weren't a voter. You didn't count in this country. Politics is how power and money and the opportunity to make money are distributed. So it's about politics, and politics is about money. A lot of Democrats say we're going to reform Citizens United, constitutional amendment. It's not going to happen, because people who have a larger stake in the community and their financial interests are going to fight to preserve their privileged access to people in power. So the way you have to do this is you have to do two things. Number one is you have to get the electorate educated and engaged. The only real hope for this country and for democracy is an educated, informed, and empowered electorate. If the electorate is educated and empowered, all that money spent on television ads is meaningless. That's where most of the money goes. It goes to businesses who own TV stations and to the networks. And they want the money. They do not want to put ideas on there as a public service, because that reduces their value. So they're not going to do that. You're not going to change the system. So get the electorate educated. And movies like the one that Susan and Jeff did are very important in doing this.
Critical thinking.
Lots and lots of people have seen this movie, and it has made a tremendous impact. And when you have celebrities who will speak out on issues, whether it's Jeff Bridges or George Clooney or somebody else, it makes a huge difference. It attracts people's attention. But you've got to get young people engaged. What worries me is, in my generation, the generation of some of you in the audience, We're the Vietnam generation. Our generation saw civil rights. My friends from Oxford, they were in Mississippi in 1964 with Medgar Evers. They saw people killed in Mississippi. They fought for civil rights. Some of them, mistakenly in my view, fought against the Vietnam War and demonstrated against it. I didn't get to go on any peace marches. Understand it was a great way to meet young women, but I didn't get to go. And but this is a generation, my generation, that believes. We're passionate about our beliefs, and we're passing from the scene. And so what about those 20 and 30-year-olds? Do they understand that all of this was built by people? You can't just take it for granted, and it's not always going to be there. So we've got to reach those young people, and they have to ask the politicians the crucial questions. Now, in the 2016 presidential election, I was working with the ethanol business. Some of you may not like ethanol, but ethanol actually has been under tremendous false attack by the oil industry for years. It's actually greener and cleaner and so forth than the petroleum. But so the question was, who's going to protect the renewable fuel standard that mandates putting ethanol in the gasoline? So we got to the national corn growers in Iowa, and we explained to them, said, look, you all are growing corn. Corn is sold for ethanol. If you want to increase the value of your crops, you have to have a demand for the crops. The cattle can only eat so much, so you need ethanol. Agree? They agree. Said, so you have to be like gun owners. Gun owners are single-issue voters. They don't care about anything but guns. That's why in Colorado, for example, when the legislature passed some restrictive gun legislation, the people that brought it were defeated in the next election. Because it doesn't matter what else you've done. If you say you're in favor of gun control in some limited fashion, they're going to get you. And so we persuaded the corn growers to behave similarly in the Iowa presidential primaries, or the caucus. So what they did is at every place there was a candidate speaking, there was somebody from the corn growers or the ethanol movement that said, do you support the renewable fuel standard? And first you got some waffling. Well, certainly I believe that, but they didn't know what it was, and they weren't solid. So you keep nailing them with it. And you have 2 or 3 people in the audience stand up, and pretty soon we got everybody but Ted Cruz, who was in the pocket of the oil industry. Every single one of them signed a pledge that they would keep the renewable fuel standard and support it. Even Hillary Clinton, who on that side of the Democratic Party, there's a lot of people who don't like ethanol. They view it as farm, and they view farm as corn, and corn is a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, and therefore it's bad. And in reality, life's pretty complicated. But if you can reduce it in the election to a single issue that's overriding importance, you can carry the day. I'm sorry to give you that long answer.
I think that's why
But
we're here.
That's what you have to do. If you want to make a difference, you got to vote, and you got to demand that the people that are running for office acknowledge that the climate is changing, and it is a national emergency, and things do have to be done. And since Trump is going to get away with a national emergency for the border, I don't see any reason why Nancy Pelosi can not declare a national emergency for climate change.
So that's, thank you for that. That's a perfect entree to my next question. Several people that I spoke with during the break wanted you to delve deeper into the Green New Deal and how we can galvanize around that, how we can implement it in a realistic way. You said it's very visionary, which is always nice to start out with a broad vision, but how can we bring that down? How can we implement it? How can we set real policy and practices? And I think, as important as anything else, how can we do the thing that you just mentioned, which is galvanizing people, particularly young people, around this concept of the Green New Deal?
So, first of all, you got to have a needs case. So I used to do debate, and the first affirmative always built the need. Did you do debate in high school or
A
college?
couple of times.
Yeah. So, I mean, you have a stack of evidence cards and you read out this and this and this and this, and you have to build the needs. That's what my pitch was. I'm building the need. You have to take action. That need to take action has to drive everything else. You don't have to get specific on what action has to be taken. That's a subject that's complicated. You got to study that. You have to bring the right people together. You can't just say, okay, we're going to abolish air travel in 8 years, get ready for it. I mean, that's silly. You're not going to do it. But what you can do is you build a needs case, and you get young people to talk about the need. They should be afraid. These young people in college, in their lifetime, they're going to see dramatic changes all over the world that will affect national security, trillions of dollars of damages, droughts, revolutions, conflicts over water, over cropland. It's all over Africa today, and it's spreading all over the world. And it's going to cause great trouble in the United States with, let's say, the Colorado River watershed. And we know what the climate models show, and it's drying out. This part of the United States is going to be even drier in 20 or 30 years, despite the polar vortex that we're suffering through today. So you get them mobilized, and then the president or the Congress, you have to set up commissions. You have to bring experts in. You have to have bipartisan approach to it, and you have to respect people's economic interests. You're not going to abolish all the power plants tomorrow and put in a bunch of wind energy somewhere. It's not going to happen. But you can bring a consensus, and then you put in the economic incentives to drive the results in your direction. A carbon tax, an incentive for wind and solar that's continued, development. You've got to invest in technologies that may never make it. So when a guy has a new technology, and I talked about broadcast power, you need to give him money. These guys are struggling down there in Texas with this. They got an overinflated sense of their own value, and it makes it hard for them to get money. This is like a Manhattan Project. If you could broadcast power without power lines, you could completely transform transportation and utilities around the world. But to do that, you're going to make some mistakes along the way. And so when a guy makes a mistake and runs into a dead end technologically, you can't call him up into Congress and belittle him. And that's what too much of the current efforts are. So the Green New Deal, in my view, it's a wonderful concept, but all the specifics are way premature. We just can't get into that. It scares people. Talk about the need. We have to face this issue. It's on us now. And then let's see what people come up with for solutions.
I was just going to add, I have a 24-year-old daughter, and she was somewhat instrumental in the film. She turned us on to some interesting philosophy, the object-oriented ontology. And here she is, she's 24. And she is very aware of all these problems. And what kids are tired of is being tired that humans are bad, so you feel guilty, or your life is just hopeless. You know, what is the point? So you want to avoid those things. And so what we always look at is desire. Like humans like to have, we like our brains to turn on. I mean, look, here's Las Vegas. People are coming here because you get all sorts of dopamine just with the hope and expectation that you might win something. And so we're talking about redirecting desire and making things like what Wesley is, or sorry, General Clark is talking about, exciting, brain candy and getting kids more excited, like all these products that we saw at the awards last night. I know Gwen, my husband, and I were really excited. We thought, wow, that is very cool, all this innovation. And so I think that's another thing, not making people feel guilty and trying to get people to redirect their desires into different activities, maybe.
So Susan, as an award-winning filmmaker, how do you do that? Can you talk a little bit more about how we can shift that object-oriented ontology from, oh, here's something shiny and new and I am enjoying retail therapy, to here's a new state of mind. Here's a new state of the world. Here's a new state of the planet. How do you shift that using whether it's emergent behavior, where there's enough of us that get excited that people catch on and all of a sudden like a flock of birds that are flying in one direction and pivot over to another?
People were really excited about cell phones, right? So those didn't exist before. People wanted them, and they find them useful as a tool as well as something fun to have, I suppose. But maybe it would be exciting to have a solar panel on your roof and wow, I'm making free energy, today. I mean, Quayne and I make more energy than we could ever hope to use in a day, but we live in Hawaii, so that's easy to do. But these are small things, but because there's so many of us, if we all started moving in that direction, then maybe it would be easier to get policy to change, which obviously we have to have as well.
So 6 million people saw a viral video from Davos conference on poverty. I don't know if you saw that, Susan?
No, I didn't see that.
But there was an African woman who was talking about poverty, and I guess a West European and an American white guy stood up and said, look, I mean, what are you talking about poverty and jobs? I mean, you've got more jobs than ever in human history. The economies around the world are going up. What are you talking about? She says, I'm talking about the dignity of work. You have people on these assembly lines and cutting chicken parts that women have to wear diapers because they're not allowed to go to the bathroom when they need to go to the bathroom. And she went on in details. 6 million people saw that. You'll find it on the internet. That's the way we have to communicate to young people. So Susan, I mean, it's a nice documentary, but why don't you and Jeff go to a meeting of a big power company, like the annual general meeting?
We would like to go to a power company. We did go to Costco. We
Okay,
met
but
with them.
go to an AGM, okay? And when the CEO says, and we're very proud to announce that we're going to produce another 500 megawatts of renewable energy next year, stand up and say, Mr. CEO, why are you limiting yourself to 500 megawatts? Why aren't you producing 2,000 megawatts next year? Why can't you develop it faster?
I think we should definitely do that.
And then have him sputter a few times and catch that and let it go viral.
I like that idea. I love that idea.
I mean, you're going to have some ways to reach young people and energize them. And as you said, they're on their phones. And they only have a 20-second attention span.
Yeah. So clearly it's going to take the entire spectrum from every one of us and every single person that we know participating, as well as the other spectrum of actual policy. So, General, one final question, just because we have a couple of minutes left. How do you think we can if we can, how can we get the current leadership to amplify their role with respect to climate action, or do we just need to wait until the next cycle?
Well, I think the more public demonstrations you have, the more outcome, the more organizations, like someone came up to me from the Climate Action Council here at this meeting, the more organizations like that speak up and find ways to get in the headlines, then the greater the receptivity of the leadership is to it. But ultimately, it's about convincing the leadership that A, there's a need to change, B, that it's not a cost, it's an opportunity, and C, that it's in their interest as elected officials to support that. Now, you're not going to get that from the United States Senate with the current composition, and not from the White House yet. Once he beats Mueller, then he'll probably become the most genteel, respectable, nice guy you've ever seen. He was going to say he's really a Democrat at heart, but right now he's in the fight for his life. So you have to have a program to reach people with something that makes economic sense and that it's in their interest. And it may well take the next election or two. We have to fight for it.
Well, Susan and General, thank you so much for your time today. We're going to move on to our next session now with Andrew Beebe, who is a venture capitalist with Obvious Ventures out of the Bay Area, who's going to talk about robotics and automation and the transformation of our cities into intelligent hubs. But thank you.
Well, thank you for putting on the event.
Thank you.
Our next guest grew energy innovations from a business plan to a major solar developer, serving customers like Google, Disney, Sony Pictures, and British Telecom. After selling the company to Suntech in 2008, he served as Chief Commercial Officer at Suntech, as well as Vice President of Global Product Strategy. During his tenure, Suntech became the largest solar company in the world. Now a partner at Obvious Ventures, please welcome Andrew Beebe.
Thank you. I'm Andrew Beebe. I am the only person up here so far who was not in the film, so we're going to shift gears a little bit. I want to thank Sarah and the entire team here for putting on a great day. I also want to thank General Clark. I don't know about all of you, but listening to him, I just kept thinking, what have I been doing with my life? He has accomplished so much and obviously done a lot of great things for the country and given us great service. General Clark, if you can still hear me, I just want to remind you that there's an election coming up, 2020. I'm just saying, you know, we could, right? So I'm a venture capitalist from San Francisco, and what that means is I'm in a profession often ridiculed and in a city often ridiculed, both combined perfectly in the HBO series Silicon Valley. So, of course, that means that I came here in a puffy Patagonia vest this morning, and my presentation will include glib references to flying cars. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Obvious Ventures. As was mentioned, I had a career in the internet space in the late 90s as an entrepreneur and started a couple of different companies, and then took a different tack in early 2002 and created two solar companies based in Los Angeles. And they were based on the basic concept for me was I was an entrepreneur, but I wanted to try and find ways to bring purpose into my professional life and make sure that I could find profit at the same time. The time was 2002, and as I'm sure you all remember, Al Gore's movie hadn't come out. The general had not run for office and made a lot of great points about what the climate crisis that we were facing. In fact, I think climate was just sort of a thermostat setting, and that was it, right? So we didn't really have a focus on this at all. And as he mentioned and made reference to, solar was literally 2 orders of magnitude more expensive than it is today. So I spent the next almost 15 years focused on the solar industry, started a couple of different solar companies, and then went into just the production and business of selling solar panels around the world, and so sold many gigawatts of solar, and then ultimately decided that there were ways to take some of that profit and purpose in combination together and do it in venture capital. And that's when I joined Obvious Ventures. So Obvious was founded in 2014 by Ev Williams, who is known to most of you, I think, probably as the founding CEO of Twitter, and my 2 other co-founding partners. And the basic idea, the sort of the why that we think of all the time as we talk to entrepreneurs, is the idea that purpose-driven founders solving the world's biggest problems will tend to outperform their peers. And I think increasingly this is an obvious concept. That's why we named the firm the way we did, but in the beginning it was not clear to everyone that you needed to marry profit and purpose in order to build the sustaining companies that are going to last forever. And yet when I think when you look back at the Apples and even the Googles and even Microsoft, these are companies that they were really purpose-driven and purpose-led by their founders. So we are based in San Francisco, as I said. We have a little over $300 million under management, and we have invested a lot of that $300 million in over 50 companies, I think around 55 today. And we invest in 3 different areas: sustainable systems, healthy living, and people power. And you might know as consumers, some of our companies like Beyond Meat. Has anyone had a Beyond Burger? All right, good, we've got some. Has anyone bought a diamond from Diamond Foundry? That's probably a smaller group. Diamond Foundry is a company that's growing, actually using technology from the solar industry and growing consumer-grade gemological diamonds in a lab and then selling them for jewelry. So this is an idea of taking what we call above-ground diamonds and trying to take on the diamond trade, which we look at as dirty and dangerous and socially challenged in the way it impacts populations around the world, and doing it with an actual diamond, just one that's grown with renewable power above ground in a lab. And then other companies like Gusto. If anyone runs a small business in here, you might use Gusto for your payroll or HR. All of those are the types of businesses that we invest in. But what I want to focus on today is sustainable systems. Sustainable systems is an area, sort of a catch-all umbrella that we use to think about mobility, energy systems, and the future of cities. And I want to focus mainly on the future of cities today. Okay. A couple of different categories within sustainable systems that we've done a substantial amount of investing in. The first, which is really the top row, is around mobility and the future of mobility, in particular the way it's going to affect cities. And then the bottom is in the built environment. And I'll dig into some of these companies throughout my talk, but along the top, all of these businesses, Amply is electric vehicle fleet management for EV charging, Proterra is an electric bus company. There are none in Vegas yet, but I'm sure many of you in cities you've come from have seen electric buses around, and most of those in America are now made by Proterra. Lilium is a electric flight company. That's the flying car reference. We checked the box there. And Fair Financial is trying to democratize and give greater access to leasing with micro leases and microfinance for car leases. In the built environment, Canvas is a stealth robotics company right now that's doing some very exciting work that they'll be able to talk about soon. Plant Prefab is a prefab housing company. Helix is a design software package for large-scale construction. And Keo helps building managers scale their building systems for multifamily buildings. So let me start with a question. I think I can do this. How many, you got to think for a second, how many of you in the audience, how many of your grandparents were born in cities? Okay, 3, 4, okay. How many of your parents were born in cities? All right, much bigger group. How many of you were born in cities? I'm in that group, right. So basically, if we were just to do, that was the chart. That was the chart that I think everybody knows, which is that we're seeing a massive migration towards cities globally. And probably that same chart of hands, the bar moving up, would be much, much greater if we had a very global group, particularly if we had a lot of participants from Asia or China. The numbers are staggering with regard to that migration. So last year, depending on how you count, but most people would say last year was the first year that over 50% of the global population lived in cities, and that's just a milestone, but because it's part of a very long and consistent trend line, I think the implications are important, and it's a good time to pause and take a look. Fun UN facts, 2.5 billion people are expected to be added over the next 20 years to the urban environment. By 2050, 2 out of every 3 people are likely to be living in cities or urban rings. So, turns out cities are pretty popular with humans. And as has been said, I think a few times this morning, this is an opportunity and a challenge. And of course, we've got to make sure that every time we see those challenges, we find opportunities. I think, when we think about the migratory journey that humans are on towards cities, we're going to see the wholesale transformation of industry after industry. And I think we can go down the list. We could look at finance, healthcare, media, food, mobility, and of course, living and working spaces. Not just the way we build spaces, which is critical and critical to everyone in this room, but the way we operate them as well. And that's, as an investor, as a venture capitalist, that's where we see real opportunity. I mean, we could say that our entire portfolio, from food investing to financial technology and in between, is really about the future of cities. So we've got to find ways that we're going to bring those 2.5 billion people into cities, but probably not do it with the same technologies that we had in the past. And that's why we think of this as a critical fork in the road. I come from San Francisco, which in many ways is, despite all the ridicule and jokes and everything, is a picture, a postcard from the future in a lot of ways. But it's also a tale of two cities. How many people are from the Bay Area? Anyone? Couple. Okay. Well, whether you live there or you've just read about it in the headlines, there are really some great things happening on the technology front, but there are also a lot of bad things happening. We've had false experiments with housing. We've tried a whole bunch of technologies with a whole bunch of experiments with the way our taxes work and city planning and mobility. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. That's not a San Francisco issue alone, but if that very futuristic city with a massive tax base and a lot of smart folks trying to solve these problems can't figure it out, we do run the risk that things could go either way as we look down the road. And when we look to other countries, especially developing countries or countries like China that are in transition and moving so many people into cities, we also have to think about what that fork in the road is going to mean for them as well. And I think that we're in a part of the fork in the road is one way goes towards cities that are really meant to just build economic engines and just build things that the bureaucracy wants, or that's really great for technology or works because of this new type of technology, but doesn't really work for the humans that are living there. Another way to look down 20 years forward or 10 years forward to 2030 is to think about a more human-centered approach to city design, to housing, to the way that we live and work. And that's the direction that we want to look in, and we constantly take, whether we're looking at robotics or artificial intelligence or other types of systems. We think a lot about how do we put the human in the center of this. And it's not just an idle or philosophical question. I think it's very practical when it comes to what kind of technology we're really going to invest in, and most importantly, what kind of technology is going to scale and last for the long haul. We're a big fan of this concept of anti-fragile systems or resilient systems, systems that are really going to persist, not just because they're hardened and they're ready for all sorts of natural disaster or climate change issues, but also because they're going to work for people today and people into the future and next generations. So I've made a little slideshow of pictures and ideas that might show these tales of two cities and the different directions things can go. So first, let's look at the bad side. There's a scenario down the line where we continue to see in different categories of work within cities the same kind of sluggishness and challenges and lack of, or inertia that we've seen over the last couple of decades. First one would be construction, right? Decreased efficiency, rising costs, aging workforces, all of those could conspire to create negative productivity. A lot of those things, like rising costs, have real reasons. They have to do with safety, they have to do with building codes, and things that are good and we don't want to get rid of. But some of the other pieces are conspiring right now to bring the costs ever increasing and set us up for failure in terms of the speed at which we want to deploy or transform neighborhoods and communities and cities to become more connected. Another one is housing. This is an actual, some of these are photographs I took. This is a photograph from San Francisco, which is unfortunately becoming, I would say, borderline acceptable in the minds of many people in the population. And this came to me the other day when I was talking to a Lyft driver and hearing about their day and their work, and we invest in ride sharing in this kind of area, so it was great to just listen, and I do that often. And he was walking me through how he drove in from the Central Valley to San Francisco, which is about a 3-4 hour drive, depending on the time of day, just to do the rides. But sometimes to get home where he could afford to live in the Central Valley, it was just too far, too late, or he was nervous about driving that late, so he would just sleep in his car. And we had this conversation as if it was sort of a normal thing, and then he would get up the next day and drive another shift. And And that transition in San Francisco, one of the wealthier cities in the United States, should be an alarm going off for a lot of people. That future for all the other cities in the United States and around the world is probably not the direction that we want to go in. So this is another one, familiar image. This is, I'm sure, Los Angeles, not San Francisco. I'm just going to say that. But traffic is debilitating in this downside scenario. Picture 10 years forward. My flight here, and this is for sure a fact, my flight here was faster than a lot of people's commutes across the San Francisco peninsula, going from San Francisco to San Jose. So even in San Francisco, where the air is a little bit clearer, we still have gridlock challenges. And of course, if anyone's been to Beijing or Shanghai or other places around the world that are going through much faster growth, you see a real problem here. And again, this is an area where we truly believe we can't get there from here. We are not going to solve these challenges with the technology that we built over the last couple of decades. This is an image I took the other day. I was in Santa Monica. I love this photo, just an iPhone photo. It was really great. I was running and at sunrise, and I was thinking about micromobility, because who doesn't think about micromobility when they're running in front of a beautiful sunrise? But I was running along the beach, and I was thinking, and this was right after the scooter mania had really hit, scooter mania being a silly buzzword for billions of dollars of venture capital going into electric scooters being carefully placed across cities to help with congestion. And then I went past this, this little waterway going out, and I looked a little bit closer, and I saw this. I don't know if you can see this thing there. This is a Bird scooter that I assume, just in protest maybe the night before, had been thrown over a fence into the waterway. So it's just a reminder that, we're doing something right is happening as we start to think about how we can electrify and give out more and more accessible pieces of mobility around the world. But there's also probably a right way to do it and a wrong way to do it. And the entrepreneurs, traditionally, we have found the entrepreneurs who come at it from a values-aligned perspective and want to build real businesses with real purpose for the long haul tend to engage with cities, engage with builders, engage with real estate developers to try to get this right. This is another favorite image of mine. This guy's job, full-time job, is to just push people into the subway every single day to jam them in and get them all to work. It's just more of a metaphor for what we're dealing with congestion around public transportation systems. I'm a native New Yorker, and the New York system is really bursting at the seams and in a lot of going through a lot of challenges. And as we look at even in California with things like high-speed rail, our ability to do this kind of mega infrastructure to fix these challenges in a timely fashion as this migration of 2.5 billion people is starting to take hold seems really challenged. If we're building cities truly from scratch, maybe we've got a shot, but otherwise this is going to be a heavy lift. Speaking of heavy lifts, this is another fun image of mine. This is somebody pushing their Tesla 20 feet just to get to the charger that's all the way over there. They just couldn't, it's like there's a last mile issue. Sometimes this was the last 20 feet. They couldn't quite get there. Again, it's a metaphor, but there are so many cases of people really trying to figure out how to adapt to this new electric vehicle world. And if it's not done right, we are going to have this challenging chicken and egg world. I'll talk about some companies that are trying to solve this in multifamily tenant housing and trying to put more and more chargers around the around cities so that there's always accessible charging. But if the timing is not right, you start to see real rejection of these EV fleets. And we saw this a long time ago with the first wave of EV systems with the RAV4 and the GM Impact before that. Not a great name for a new vehicle, I think, Impact. But despite the name, it was also a chicken and egg issue with charging that really got it, had it struggling. So now, enough of that. That's one dark 10-year period of 2030 and how things could go really wrong if we don't dig in, pay attention, and focus on those people who are trying to build businesses for the long haul. The other side of it is people who are very focused, and I think probably a lot of people in this room focused on net positive energy homes, not just net zero homes, I think Susan, the producer, mentioned that she had a net positive home in Hawaii. I think probably a lot of people, I do, a lot of people in this room probably do. We're moving now toward, and I think someone is speaking in the afternoon about net zero water homes, and then also net zero waste in the way that we design and construct. And I think we've got a long way to go there. But we can do that. There are examples of this abound around the world. There was a site in China, I think a 57-story building that was put up in 19 days with prefab modules in 2015. Still standing, which is great. But there's also a next wave of this, and focused around entire communities that are being reimagined to be much more tightly integrated ecologically, biologically with their surroundings and with their communities. This is a project, an actual project in Turkey by Project Dror, which is a fully integrated eco-community that I think is an example of where things could go. You can, I think projectdrawer.com is where you can learn more about that. And then there's also prefabricated systems and robotics and automation. This is an area we focus on a lot in construction technology companies. This image here is from one of our invested companies, Plant Prefab. We're installing there, I think, a piece of a dorm in Berkeley, a 19-unit dorm that went up about 9 months ago. In robotics and sort of fanciful things like 3D printing of homes, et cetera, there's a lot more work to be done, of course, but we do look at this concept of taking things that are dirty, dull, and dangerous and bringing in machinery to help with that, so that you have upskilled labor working hand in hand with these technologies. This is not a replacement, but an augmentation, so we should be able to make people much more productive and give them higher skill opportunities and higher wage opportunities. We call it superhumanizing of those construction workers. And now back to the flying car. This is the last one, but this is actually a company, Lilium, that we invested in, which is making vertical takeoff and landing all electric air taxis. So this company, and there are now probably a dozen other companies, including Airbus and Boeing and Embraer, going after this industry. These vehicles in general, the whole class of vehicles, are all electric, zero emission depending on the source of power, but certainly zero emission in use, and can travel usually between 200 and 300 miles per hour when they're in flight, not when they're just taking off. But they can land vertically and take off vertically. So this is a new class of vehicle that I think is going to transform a lot of the way people get around, and is definitely in the space to watch. But 10 years hence, I think it was Morgan Stanley just came out with a study that said there would be something like 200 to 400,000, not 200 to 400,000, but 200,000 to 400,000 of these vehicles flying within 10 years. So it'll be an interesting thing to see how quickly they develop, but we certainly believe that they're ready. And then in public transportation, this is a company, Proterra, that we're invested in. There are a number of now electric bus companies, including some of the traditional players, Gillig and others, who are playing catch-up. But because of leaders like Proterra and BYD, a Chinese company, everyone in the industry has said it's time to go. And we're finally at a break point where these vehicles are more cost-effective than diesel hybrids, or natural gas buses. And this is the kind of thing that I think we would all say goes very, very slowly for a long time, like mobile phones turning into smartphones. But when they finally click, they take off. And we're seeing that with electric buses today, and I think we'll be seeing it with passenger vehicles very soon, and then air travel beyond that. So all of these things combine to really create a urban view that's quite different than where things might go, or even where things have been. And I think that there are a couple of things that we have to think about how we're going to enable that transformation. This is a funny image. This is an actual ad from the 1950s where doctors back then, of course, were, I don't know if anyone was smoking Lucky Strikes, you don't have to raise your hands, but doctors were endorsing cigarettes, right? And this was a very common practice. We've come a long way in just 50 years. Until Juul came along, so now I guess we've taken a huge step backwards. But we've come a long way, and in a lot of ways, we've of course, progressed in safety and building codes, but there's a long way to go to progress as much because we're still using a lot of the same techniques and technologies to build as we did back then. So these guys are looking pretty psyched on the job site. They're very psyched because costs have continued to climb and wages have continued to climb. This is a 10-year number. Probably a lot of people in the room are familiar with these statistics, but this could be a 50-year number. We've seen labor costs, labor wages continue to climb, and in many ways that's good, but costs overall could change with greater productivity, and that's the area that we're really focused on. If we continue with negative productivity in the space, we think there's real risk of this industry being radically disrupted. And in Silicon Valley, we see it all the time. It is brutal and in many ways an unstoppable force when you think about the transitions that have happened over time. In each of these categories, there's been this sort of radical disruption that when something becomes inefficient enough and unwilling to change enough, they are just completely taken over. And of course, this could be a long list. There's Skype, there's all sorts of transportation systems, and many types of e-commerce, not just Amazon. But these are some big names that it took a long time. It took about 20 years, 20 years for the right to, and 10 years for the music industry, or maybe 15 years for music, and then about 5 years on the taxi transition. But these industries have been disrupted. These are one-way streets. They are not going back. There might be some holdout areas, and there'll certainly be some niche players and others who will take advantage of the seams. But all in all, because of a lack of ability to embrace new technology, these industries have been transformed. So that brings us to looking at the construction space and the built environment and property technology as well. I don't expect anyone to really read this whole thing, but this was a McKinsey study that looked at, I think, 20 industries, including oil and gas, advanced manufacturing, healthcare, et cetera, across about a dozen indicators of how well digitized they were and how well they were embracing technology. And you probably guessed it, but construction is second to last down at the bottom. And we've got a long way to go. There's a ton of work we could do to enable new technology, and we can find ways to move from a very bespoke craftsman mentality to something where we can productize things a little bit more, where there's still craftsmanship and art going into the way people are working, but we're doing it with deeply enabled technology that allows for greater productivity and greater access to choices at lower costs for more people. So I'll talk about a couple of different areas that very specifically that we think are going to enable some of that digitization and some of that technology so that we don't see radical disruption, but rather migrate to that mindful metropolis, as we call it in 2030, that is connected and clean and more communal, but also allows for a lot of the same industries to make it happen. So in the world of manufactured construction, there are a couple of companies. Plant Prefab is one that we invested in, but Katerra and Blockable and many others are trying to bring some of the best of manufacturing techniques into the construction industry. And this is an area we believe in across the board and have seen a lot of opportunity. I'm sure there will be many failures. As General Clark said, we have to take a lot of risks, and some of these things aren't going to work out. But I do believe that this idea that we bring, at least in certain cases, some of the production off-site and then integrate and make more of a productized way of bringing things to the site is going to be part of the digitization that takes shape. Plant Prefab in particular is focused on single-family, urban infill, and small multifamily. So these are all semi-custom homes, but individuals now, for the first time in the semi-custom space, can go online, really design their own homes, and have a review with an architect and a contractor, have a general contractor do the site prep work, and then in 6 weeks have a full home delivered on the back of a number of trucks. And I should have brought a video. It's pretty incredible to watch a time lapse. I've seen these. I've stood as an entire home in Palo Alto was delivered over 8 hours from the street with biggie cranes dropping them in. These things can move very, very quickly. In the in the construction and this idea of superhumanizing construction workers, I'll just mention a few companies. I mentioned Canvas, which we already invested in, but FastBricks and Built Robotics are two companies that are integrating robots into the work stream. And in an ideal setting, in the case of Built Robotics, we're not an investor there, but they take the driver out of these vehicles, but they're still the same skill level. They're just in a safer environment. They're not out right there on the work site, and that allows for a much more productive environment where some of these can do some autonomous work, but oftentimes they're semi-autonomous or teleoperated. So these types of companies are bringing in, I think, much-needed technology to upgrade. We've seen now a couple in the craning space to give a much safer environment, not just for the operators of the cranes, but obviously the entire job site and any pedestrians that might be down below. Another place that we're really excited is in the world of new living and work environments. So we haven't made an investment here, but Airbnb on the residential side, and WeWork, and now We Company, including We Live, mainly on the commercial side, have really transformed the way buildings operate. And this isn't just a mindset of millennials all wanting to work in open communal spaces with a keg in the corner or whatever. It's also an entirely different set of technology that allows for rapidly changing footprints on any given floor or within any building, and a lot of different requirements in terms of the needs of a diverse set of startups and or big companies that are coming to work out of their spaces. Airbnb is very technology enabled and wants to be more technology enabled with the way we can access the apartments that we go and rent for a night or two, the way we can think about operating them once we're inside, and the way we can focus on our safety and cleanliness within these buildings. So there's a ton of technology behind that. There are now entire companies like Lyric, Ollie, and others who are just part of that universe of co-living and co-working spaces, and are ultimately, we think, going to turn into multi-billion-dollar businesses. In many ways, some of these on the residential side may be the new Hilton and Marriott and Hyatt brands, because they're creating a better experience, and usually at a substantially discounted price from where the older brands are today and what they're doing. So it's not just about the built environment, but also the operations, which goes hand in hand with how we build them out, but the operations of those buildings commercially and residentially. And then, of course, how we get around. I mentioned Proterra, the bus company, but we spend a lot of time in what I call ACE's autonomous, connected, electric, and shared vehicle ecosystem. There's been a ton of buzz about autonomous vehicles, and that is an exciting space. There's a lot to invest in there and a lot of great work being done. But even just making sure that vehicles are connected and then finding ways that they can be better shared as assets, I think is going to transform that space. Unfortunately, I didn't get the autonomous work done in time. My son is turning 16 any day now, and I was really hoping that I would just have autonomous cars fully funded so he wouldn't have to be out on the roads, but he's driving. The ACES space will nonetheless have huge impact in the way we control the cars and think about asset ownership. And I do think it's likely that the next generation, maybe starting with my son, won't be car owners, even if they are still drivers. And that's going to transform the way we think about disposable income and what we do with it. There are a couple of companies there that I'll just mention. Amply is one we invested in doing electric vehicle fleet charging, but there's another company called EverCharge, which is working on multi-port systems for apartment buildings, which for charging, as I mentioned before, is a real challenge. And then there are also companies, in fact, entire funds and real estate development companies focused just on preparing for vertical takeoff and landing air taxis. The real estate component there is the chicken and egg version that chargers are for electric cars. The real estate for landing pads is going to be a huge component of what has to happen to make things work for electric vehicles. So there's a company just focused on finding land on top of buildings, but more importantly on top of things like parking garages or train stations to make sure that we have those access points for electric flight. So I will close just by coming back to this human-centered component. The mindful metropolis needs to be built around humans. if it's top down and it's just government saying this is the way it's going to be, that's not always terrible. I think there's a partnership opportunity there, but it really has to come from the ground up. And if we do that right, it will be human-centered. If we do it from a bureaucratic standpoint or from the standpoint of what a company wants or what's sort of best for the artificial intelligence or some machine-like concept, we're going to end up with real distress and challenges, some of which we saw in those pictures earlier, but I think everybody understands as we think about economic inequality in this country and around the world, it's that kind of physical setup that is not going to serve anyone well if we don't get it right now. So we're really looking for those purpose-driven founders and companies that want to scale substantially, but also for the long haul and want to build this mindful metropolis that's clean, communal, and connected in very thoughtful, long-term ways. Thank you. Here we go.
Andrew, thank you very much. We have a few minutes for some of my questions. So we went to college together, actually, on the East Coast, and I know that you spent a lot of your time in the solar industry, but I didn't hear very much about investments in solar technology. So first, I'd like to ask you, talk to us a little bit about why you're not investing right now in solar.
Yeah, it's a great question. I loved my time in the solar industry, and we took, when I did Google's corporate headquarters solar installation there, I think it was $13 a watt, and if anyone in the audience does solar, you know that's a egregious amount, and yet it was won on a competitive bid. Today, that same job would probably, it was a complex project, but it would probably be something like $3 per watt or $4 per watt, and some corporate, my old colleagues at NextEra are now doing jobs that are in the sub-dollar per watt on the utility scale. That's extraordinary, and it's a great accomplishment, and I think everyone in that industry should be really proud of what happened. And now it is the domain of big companies. It's so successful that it doesn't really, I don't believe that it needs that much more from the startup world. I think it needs a lot of financial work and a lot of support from lenders and tax equity managers and others, but I believe that we don't need to do that much more there. I will say we've invested in two solar companies, one called Mosaic and one called Siton, but they're both, one is a fintech company helping finance solar, and Siton is also a fintech company helping small businesses finance their solar projects around the country as small independent installers, and then is a sort of a SaaS software platform for them. So a little bit different spin, but I have not gotten deep into the technology that I used to be involved with because I feel like we're good.
That's encouraging to hear, actually. So you talked about reimagining cities with respect to human-centered design and enabling technologies. In your best case scenario, in, I guess, the split of the road this way, can you talk a little bit more about what that reimagined city would look like, again, with respect to performing as an intelligent hub and also just incorporating those enabling technologies?
Yeah, thanks. We're really excited about what, even 10 years forward, cities can become. And in this question about sort of the Green New Deal, I thought General Clark's comments were great, and I would just go further to say that we have to get on this now, so a debate is very valuable, but cities, I love mayors, because mayors have to get stuff done, maybe a president gets stuff done, maybe they don't, I don't know, but mayors, Democrats or Republicans, they just have to make cities operate. They're really chief executives, and I think that there's a strong incentive for cities to get this right and get it right now. So my version of that is this clean, connected, and communal work. And connected could mean, we talked about clean. I think what it could mean is zero emission cities. So not just net zero emission, but cities that are designed either from the ground up or, let's say, retrofitted to, I think this is happening already, but not let in internal combustion vehicles. So we'd still have vehicles driving around on the ground and in the air, but they just wouldn't be combustion vehicles. That's not that difficult, and UPS and FedEx and others are really taking the lead to make sure that works. In the connected space, what I mean by connected is connected socially, so to make sure that we're not really isolated as individuals, as families, as friends, but also connected digitally and connected with the city itself. So here's a great opportunity for government technology companies to make voting really work. Let's find a way so that everyone can vote, maybe from their phones if we can find a way to do it securely, but certainly in a way that's friction-free and does not involve being a property owner or some of the other restrictions that we've had over the last couple of hundred years. And then communal is just finding ways to build social spaces. There's a very interesting dynamic now we're seeing with millennials who are in these co-living spaces where they have smaller rooms that give it a much lower cost rent structure, and then they've got these big communal spaces. And when it was first just like sort of written about that this co-living concept was a hot investment space, somebody I'm sure tweeted, didn't we just used to call that roommates? You know, why is it a hot space that you have roommates? But in fact, and I didn't tweet that, but I had that feeling. I felt like, gosh, we just make these silly names for everything. But as I looked at it and talked to people that were much younger than I am, they revealed to me that they are craving community and really lost in their phones and lost in either in work settings or digitally not getting the social interaction that they want. So people are moving into these co-living spaces not because of cost, in some cases because of cost, but also to just sort of stir the pot socially and make sure that they have real community spaces that are beyond just one or two roommates. So I think there's a real craving, and there's a ton we can do with urban planning, with social living situations, but also in co-work situations to build more community with the people in the cube next door to you.
Nice, thank you. You mentioned the Green New Deal, and I'm going to go back to that because there was a lot of discussion about that during the break. Clearly, what's being proposed with this Green New Deal is certainly it's policy at the federal level, but can you talk a little bit about how venture capital and just private equity in general can help backfill that to help make some of those things happen, frankly, with or without the policy?
Yeah, I mean, we have so much great policy already, particularly at the state levels around renewable portfolio standards. 8 governors on both sides of the aisle were elected in this last election on a 100% renewable ticket, really pushing that, maybe not as a single issue thing, as the general was mentioning, but certainly as part of their platform. So those have to go through and get enacted in some cases, but that's a great start. And Hawaii and California doing 100%, we'll see that, I'm sure, with many, many other cities, many other states. That work happens, and then investment comes. So one thing investors can do is make sure that wherever those things are in process, we're promoting them and making sure they happen. Net zero building standards, et cetera. I mean, California has certainly been in a lead position on a lot of these. All of those are things that investors, real estate developers, and others can get behind, and we're seeing them do that because they are seeing it as great economics. NextEra Energy is the company I used to work for in Florida. They are one of the largest wind and solar developers in the country, and they used to be one of the largest gas developers, and they were one of the largest nuclear developers, and they've just transitioned to the better and better economic energy opportunities where they could play a role. So now you're seeing money pour into those types of opportunities because it's so crystal clear that they are anti-fragile. You wouldn't, I mean, almost at any price, I just don't think people are going to say, I'll take the risk on financing a new coal plant anywhere in the country today. The risk is so high that that's not going to work out. We're also seeing that with nuclear power. Hopefully there's some new technology developments on that front, but meanwhile, I think most of the ardent supporters of nuclear for the last 20 years will tell you that whether they want this to be true or not, it's just unlikely that we're going to be building another or starting a new nuclear plant in the next 20 years. So I think there are a lot of places that venture and private equity and real estate and others can dig in. But energy is a layup, and then focusing wherever you're, in whatever industry you're in, whether it's green building or mobility, focusing on making sure that your approach and your investment hypothesis builds in that anti-fragile nature, I think is going to be key.
Thank you. Shifting gears a little bit, you pretty much described a transportation revolution with Lilium and the air taxis, which is fascinating, and then of course with autonomous driving. Can you delve a little bit deeper into what is happening there and what you foresee in the next 5, 10, 20 years there?
Yeah, it's a, I'm not going to suggest that this is a no-brainer and it will only be obvious in hindsight, but the electric air transportation space is one of the more exciting and dynamic spaces, in my opinion, in mobility, because a lot is happening under the radar, so to speak. But we're seeing all sorts of things happening, not just within the military, who have financed and supported some incredible entrepreneurial work in the space, but in cargo transit, it's not so much getting your Domino's pizza delivered by drone, but having large shipments moving around big chunks of land, but doing it through autonomous flight of drones. I looked at a company for investment called Zipline, which is doing movement of blood through different parts of Western Africa that are just so remote. They can get to, there's a hospital deep inland, but getting there is very difficult, in some cases dangerous, and they'll use unmanned air transit to get large quantities of necessary blood to the hospitals. And as it turns out, the economics are extraordinary. These are profitable and exciting businesses from a venture standpoint. So I think that that's already happening. You know, they're running flights today. We don't see it as much in the United States because we have very restricted drone rules. But drones, you know, there are millions of drones deployed around the world commercially, and they are leading to this leapfrogging and advancement in software and in sensors and energy storage, which I think are powering that revolution. Human flight definitely is probably 5 years out, but we have some healthy debates and small wagers in our office about whether you're going to see autonomous flight before you see autonomous driving. Autonomous flight technically is actually much easier. You have far fewer obstacles. The edge cases are much lower. There are no pedestrians in flight. There are a lot of things. There are birds, but that's about it, and then other drones. And we're building right now, the FAA, NASA, and a lot of major companies are working on air traffic management systems that will help coordinate, at least between the devices in the air. So a lot of things have to come together to make all of that work, but it is, in some ways, I think going to prove to be easier than the very, very complex effort on the ground for autonomous.
Thank you. Just staying on Lilium for a minute, the concept of air taxis, because this is fascinating, and forgive my own ignorance here. Do those fly shorter distance and lower altitudes than airplanes?
Yeah, so look, we've looked at 20 companies probably doing everything from delivering a pizza across the street. I don't know what the purpose of that is, but all the way to full passenger flight vehicles that take off and land like a normal winged vehicle on an airstrip and are all electric. And there are people, we haven't made an investment here, but there are certainly engineers and entrepreneurs who believe that we're going to see passenger vehicles flying at normal flight altitudes very soon that are all electric. And then there are others who are doing hybrids. We've even looked at a large-scale cargo vehicle that can fly from China may be able to fly from China to the United States, very large, like 747 size, with almost no fuel, but do so very, very slowly. So literally like a 25-hour, 36-hour flight. There are a lot of strange things you can do as you think about how to get jet fuel out of the system. But to answer your question, most companies are focused on either short hop flights, and those are the like human drone, passenger drones that are just quadcopters or octocopters, and they'll just lift vertically, go a mile or something, and then come down. It's a very difficult vehicle because helicopters are really inefficient. It's very hard to just use something going like this without having lift from a wing. So those are challenging, but they can go short distances. And there's a company, there's some very scary test video you could see online from EHang. It's a company in China where they have fewer regulations in the way they're doing some of the testing that give you a sense of it working. I believe they've had a clean safety record, but it's sometimes hard to watch. And then there are other companies like Lilium, and there's another American company called Joby, which are doing a combination where they have fixed wing, but also vertical takeoff and landing. So most of those will take off vertically using some form of set of rotors like a drone, but then transition into flight. And once they're in flight, because of the use of the wing, you have a much more efficient system of propulsion, and those vehicles are meant to fly usually in the 50 to 200 mile range, and that should just increase over time. And those would fly at a similar height like a helicopter. So you could think of them as, you know, their first industry could be taking over the helicopter trips between New York and JFK. We used to have them in the Bay Area, but they were too loud, and these are going to be much quieter vehicles. They're still not, they're louder than a Harley, probably quieter than a helicopter, but much, much cheaper because these vehicles are so simplistic. They sound Jetson-like and space-age and crazy, but in reality, just like an electric car is a much, much simpler system for propulsion. The same is true in the air.
Thank you. Last question about transportation before we move on to some other topics. We're seeing some pretty incredible commitments, for example, in Europe, like in France, that are committing to the full electrification of transportation and phasing out combustion engine vehicles. We're seeing some of the automotive companies like Volvo making commitments to full electrification to vehicles that they create. When do you think we're actually going to see the full electrification of our transportation industry?
Well, it's tough. I guess the analogy I would use is a little bit like the energy space. You know, when I started in solar, everyone would say, look, you know, we're 1/10, at most 1/10 of 1% of the whole energy landscape. How could this ever really matter? And honestly, the speed at which we transition that to it matters surprised even me. And I was the entrepreneur, you know, pitching to venture capitalists saying we found a way to get to $1 a watt. I didn't have it all figured out, but I figured we'd find a way. And in fact, I was a small part of that, but the industry really did. What we eventually started looking at was, why are we looking at what percentage of the overall energy pie we are when we should be looking at what is the new build, you know, of energy? Because that's really the only comparable of all new construction last year in energy. Wind and solar were the dominant new construction. And that is a shocking turn of events. You know, we're talking in 20 years, you know, when I started, if I had said to people in 10 years, the 5 largest coal companies in America are going to be bankrupt, they would say, you're crazy. And 10 years later, they were bankrupt. So I think we're probably at the beginning of that curve in automotive. When you get to 1% penetration of anything, usually that's when the hockey stick starts to show up, if you've got something that can cross the chasm in terms of adoption. And we're now crossing 2%, and in different parts of the world, even more than that in automotive. So we'll see, but I think key to this is more alternatives than just get in line for a Model 3 or whatever it is. And we're starting to see that from Europe because of some of the leadership on the political side of things.
Great, thanks. Moving on to the built environment, you talked obviously about plant prefab and just prefab construction in general. Can you talk a little bit more about how robotics and automation are going to transform the job site and how it's going to help facilitate a more efficient and high-performance built environment?
Yeah, I think this is another thing. It's a little bit like autonomous driving. We're excited about it, but we're also cautious because sometimes when you say robotics or artificial intelligence, suddenly the valuation of your company goes up threefold or something, and it's tempting to fit technology into challenges that don't necessarily exist. Humans are great at a lot of things. People in the construction trades do incredible things and spend decades learning how to do them. So, bricklaying, I'm not sure bricklaying is going to be better done by a robot. We've seen companies that really are meant to work side by side with humans, just like a leveling laser would or something. You know, there are a lot of technologies we use today in construction that maybe they're not robots, but obviously a chop saw is automating something that we used to do by hand. So we have been a little bit cautious, but I think that there are some cases where when you're talking about heavy lift environments or things, particularly with machine vision, where you want to look at a lot of things at once. I mentioned the crane example. If we could have a crane operator sitting in a cube that had, or even within a crane, had a heads-up display that was automatically looking for dangerous areas of interest that operator might want to look at, you will have, it's a little bit like driver's assistance. You just have an extra set of eyes telling you, look out over there, that crane is moving toward you, or this truck just came into your path, or if you knew, what that path was going to look like, it would be able to give you a green light or red light or yellow light. So a lot of those basic safety components, I think, are going to start bringing in machine vision, and I would expect to see that first before, let's call them full robotics, might show up. And then in 3D printing, I mean, we've certainly seen things that are fun to look at, time-lapse videos of small homes being built with 3D printers, really just laying out slurry and things like that. The way we've looked at it is, in combination with machine vision, you're going to see devices that are doing things like chalk lines and other things to help align things that are coming from a prefabricated factory to make sure they're getting put in the right places and integrating with your BIMs and things like that. So to be determined, but we've got one company in stealth that's doing a lot of fun things in that area, and I think there'll be more to come in the next couple of years.
Great, thank you. Last question for you is, Obvious Ventures, as you mentioned earlier, is very focused on purpose-driven companies that are simultaneously profitable and sustainable. Can you talk a little bit about how, over the years, that has evolved? And I spoke earlier about the fact that our environmental and economic realities can no longer not be connected. So talk a little bit more about the connection between profitability and sustainability in a business context.
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, my partners who founded the firm and I have always, I think, all come together around this idea that when you look at great companies that are built, even Johnson & Johnson and other companies, when you look at their founding credos and you look at their value sets, they really meant to be driven for the long haul. Some of them maybe lost their way, and ultimately, I think it's consumers and employees who bring them back or tell them we're moving on. And an example of this, we do a lot of food investing. We keep saying millennials, but younger people and increasingly all people are aligning their purchasing behavior with their value set. And this wasn't always true. We would just get cheese or Velveeta or whatever and just sort of assume it was okay or trust in these brands. But with the internet really comes this kind of transparency where you get to know everything. You have to look a little bit, maybe somebody looks on your behalf, but we now have ingredient labels, and when you read an ingredient, you think, what is that? With one click, you can figure out what that thing is. And when you figure out that thing, by the state of California, has been told to a lot of people that might cause cancer or whatever, you get to learn much more about the brands that you've come to trust, and that has caused a lot of erosion in that, and they've thus looked to new brands. And survey after survey will show that younger people do not plan to use their parents' brands for food, for healthcare products, for automotive, et cetera. I mean, they really want to move to something newer, different, and better. And that's been a boon from an investment standpoint. The other side of it is that the same goes for the job market. If they have a choice, increasingly young people want to work, and this is shown, McKinsey and everybody else does these studies, they want to work somewhere where they actually truly deeply believe in the value set of that company. And maybe that, is misappropriated. It has to be the value set of the founders or of the people that they work for, but that's very different than 50 years ago. I'm sure a lot of people 50 years ago did want to do that, but statistically not with the same vigor, not to the point where they're going to make it a choice in which job they take. And those two things combined, purchasing behavior and professional behavior, we think is what sort of holds the key to the future. Those things are, in my opinion, one-way streets. You don't go back and say, you know what, I'll take the really awful stuff. Or, you know what, I'll go work for a bunch of jerks. I mean, if we had to do that, we'd do it. But ultimately, now, increasingly, people with choices are going to make the right ones.
Andrew, thank you so much. What a delightful conversation. You just are a wealth of information. We have an hour now for lunch. Lunch will be served outside. And Andrew, you're sticking around.
Yeah,
so if you have
I'll
any
be here.
questions for Andrew, he'll be around and available. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks, Chris.